Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good Monday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 18th of August. As always, we encourage you to stay informed about your local weather situation, no matter what part of Alaska you're in. You can always tune into your NOAA weather radio or log on to weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov for your complete look at Alaska's weather online. The weather info line is open at 800-472-0391. You can find each Weather Service office on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube, and you can find out other information about what's going on Alaska's weather simply by using a search for the hashtag AKWX. Anytime you tweet us or put information on Facebook, that's also a great way to kind of let us know that you're talking about Alaska weather if you'd like us to see that. Here's what's going on in South Central. About the most active part of the weather in recent days has been across South Central and southwestern Alaska with some heavier rainfall. There is still some moderate flooding going through the Ski Lac Lake and Kenai Keys region. That has crested, but there's still going to be some higher levels of water going through the Kenai River area, heading for the coast, of course, and downstream as we go into the next several days. So a flood advisory now has been extended until Wednesday. You'll remember last week we had that up until at least Monday. So we're still looking at some elevated levels of water, but it looks like the crest has passed again, the Kenai Keys and the Ski Lac Lake area there along the Kenai River. So along the Kenai River and the Kasilof area, there's still a flood advisory in effect until Wednesday morning. Now, if you look at the weather pattern, it's shifted quite a bit since the last 24 to 48 hours. We've got high pressure that's building in across the Gulf and out across the west. That is pushing more of the active weather in from west to east, and with that we've got numerous areas of showers and probably a couple thunderstorms developing out across the west. A wealth of clouds out across the upper Yukon and the eastern slopes of the Brooks Range from Barrow to Kaktovik. Again, you can see quite a bit of cloud cover there. If you look at it with the visible satellite picture, you can see kind of the clouds bubbling up across the Yukon, Koyukuk, and Kobuk rivers all the way into the north slope this afternoon. But an awful lot of cloud cover has left the Gulf of Alaska region. Southeast also experiencing some slightly drier weather there as the clouds are breaking up. And you don't see the wealth of stratus or fog across a large part of the Bering. Even that is breaking up thanks to high pressure sitting across the southwestern coast. Here's another look at the visible satellite picture, and you can see how the clouds are slowly breaking up north of Fairbanks, and then as soon as they do, they bubble up into those showers, and again, probably a few thunderstorms heading into the Seward Peninsula area, though Kotzebue Sound looks pretty dry and clear as of 4 o'clock this afternoon. Here's a look at the surface chart then. High pressure is starting to take over the Bristol Bay region at 1,021 millibars and also the central and western Gulf. That's probably made for a pretty nice day around Kodiak today. It's also holding back a lot of subtropical moisture across the North Pacific. You can see that wave of low pressure just on the very bottom of your screen. Across southeast, some hints of sunshine there from time to time today. A few showers and storms north of the Talkeetnas. You can see some of those blossoming if you look toward the Anchorage area. And then northward, a frontal boundary sitting across the Arctic coast with a wave of slightly cooler weather trying to make it in from Kotzebue Sound and the Seward Peninsula. Out across the west, or eastern Siberia, another wave of colder air is trying to drop southward toward the Bering Sea. And yet another storm is working its way eastward toward the western Aleutians. That's going to take its own sweet time over the next few days, barely making it into the western Bering Sea by the end of our forecast period here. High pressure will be in charge of the Gulf at 1,020 millibars, and a second system there also trying to hold back the clouds and squash rain chances across the west. But once again, the predominant flow around this will be in a clockwise fashion, bringing more of that westerly flow right into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and Norton Sound. So showers will likely be focused in some of those areas, and especially along the lowlands. A few showers are possible across the Brooks Range tonight, as well as a few scattered areas of wetter weather across the upper interior and across the northern sections of southeast, maybe skirting a little bit further southward toward Wrangell and Petersburg. Out across the west, Kiska and Attu, probably looking at some a little bit higher breezes and some better chances of rainfall tonight. That will slowly creep eastward tomorrow. But remember, high pressure still in charge here, and just south and west of Nunivak Island and right over the Pribilofs. You might even have a little bit of clearing throughout your daytime tomorrow. Low pressure across the central and northern Gulf will try and work its way northward on the western side of the ridge. Southeast should enjoy a little more sunshine as we go through Tuesday and into Wednesday, thanks to the protection here. And eventually, more and more sunshine for Kodiak Island and even parts of south central, though clouds will be passing through. A better chance for a little more steadier rainfall out across the western coastline, and showers and thunderstorms a little bit more likely across the middle and upper Yukon Valley, the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range, and probably in the northern parts of the Susitna Valley, and especially the western side of the Alaska Range, with high pressure again forcing that air right into the higher slopes there of the terrain. As we get into Wednesday, we'll keep that chance for showers and probably some storms across the western Alaska Range. For sure, around low pressure as it's centered up across the interior, probably a better chance for places like Fairbanks and northward. And then you go to the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range, better chance for some widely scattered storms there. High pressure sitting north of Nunivak Island will focus more precipitation chances across the Seward Peninsula and Norton Sound. And our low pressure system across the west isn't budging too much. That is still bringing in more of a southerly flow across Adak and Atka and Kiska, with a chance of showers ahead of it. A few areas of fog probably forming on the south side of the ridge there, so the Pribilofs will be very close to that. And the extension of that ridge across the western Gulf at 1,021 millibars will probably keep more sunshine across a good chunk of Kodiak Island, south central Prince William Sound, and still southeastern Alaska, looking high and dry at this point going into the midweek, with high pressure sitting east of Barrow at 1,023 millibars. We should expect a much better chance for fog across the Arctic coast through the Bering Sea. So if you have plans to move equipment there along the coastline, plan for probably what could be a little bit lower visibility during that period. As we go into southeast for temperatures today, upper 50s and lower 60s were had, especially the further south you went toward Ketchikan and Annette. Around Prince William Sound, temperatures were closer to 60 degrees, 63 in Anchorage, lower 60s for Homer and Seward, 55 out in Middleton Island, 66 in Kodiak today. Up to Susitna Valley, temperatures held just below 60 degrees in Talkeetna, mid 60s for Fairbanks, 58 in Eagle, 55 in Northway, and 56 around Fort Greely. Northward, Anaktivik Pass was 52. Arctic Village and Fort Yukon were not plotting today. Same goes for Kaktovik. 59 around Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse with 38 at Barrow, 43 in Atkasuk, so certainly milder inland as it typically is. 40s and 50s for a good part of the Kotzebue Sound region, 57 around Nome, and Norton Sound temperatures weren't that much different around Unalakleet and Point southward. Temps held in the mid-50s today. Same goes for St. Lawrence Island. McGrath was a mild 62 this afternoon, as Tanana was just a hair cooler today. As you get out toward Grayling, temperatures were in the mid-50s. Bethel was showing 56, 64 in Dillingham. King Salmon not too far behind. Many along the Alaska Peninsula were in the upper 50s and lower 60s. With the Pribilofs in St. Paul, another very warm day at 57 degrees, with Dutch Harbor, Unalaska at 54. Adak and Atka about the same, and 53 out around Attu. Now, overnight temperatures won't change too much out across the Alaska Peninsula or the chain. 49 is expected around St. Paul tonight. Same goes for Nunivak Island and a good part of the southwestern coastline. Dillingham, King Salmon will be closer to 50 degrees. 53 in Kodiak, south central in the upper 40s and lower 50s. Southeast also looking at mainly lower 50s, though 54 degrees is possible around Ketchikan. As you look at Fairbanks, expect overnight lows in the upper 40s to about 50 degrees for Fort Yukon. Most of the Brooks Range temperatures will also dip just below that 50-degree mark, and the Arctic coast will primarily stay in the lower 40s, with a few exceptions there around Wainwright and Barrow, probably a little bit cooler in the 30s tonight, with Nome at 48. A high temperature of 57 is expected tomorrow, with many areas along the Arctic coast in the lower 40s. As you get into the interior, those temperatures should blossom nicely, with a little more dry air working in at the lower levels. Expect temperatures back in the mid to upper 60s. Now, with any dry air that you have and the moisture coming in from the west, would expect again another round of showers and maybe some storms in your area. South Central is looking at the mid 60s, southeast, lower 60s, including Juneau at 63, and a net probably closer to the 70-degree mark, so certainly milder the further south you go. 62 around Kodiak, lower 60s for the Alaska Peninsula, St. Paul and St. George in the lower 50s, and central and western parts of the chain will probably only make it into the lower to mid-50s for your Tuesday. Once again, a few showers and storms are expected across the interior for tomorrow's flying weather. We'll see some patchy IFR conditions, mainly north and west of Kaktovik, and just east of Barrow to all the way into the Bering Strait and around the western and southern coastlines of St. Lawrence Island. Around the Pribilofs and west, you'll expect IFR conditions and MVFR through patchy areas in the Gulf and just nosing into southeastern Alaska by the afternoon. Parts of Bristol Bay and the western coastline will see IFR conditions right along the coast, but for most areas in the interior, we should have VFR flying, save for that convection that we were just talking about. Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass are both expecting VFR conditions throughout the day. We should see VFR flying through Lake Clark and Merrill Pass and into Rainy Pass and Windy Pass. Visual flight rule seems to be the rule tomorrow. Isabel Pass, probably watching for some thunderstorms in the afternoon. We'll see the same conditions there develop in Mentasta Pass with VFR through most of the day. Tanita Pass should see VFR flying throughout your Tuesday. Porter's Pass looking to be VFR through Tuesday afternoon, and Chilkoot and White Pass also looking for improvements there with VFR in both areas. For freezing levels, expect some colder air to linger across the west coast and probably into the central chain. Those levels could go a little bit lower than 6,000 feet. You'll also notice some colder air up across the eastern Brooks Range and into the upper Yukon Valley. Meanwhile, ridging's taking place here across the south-central coastline into southeast, and you can see those levels are rising a little bit from southeast to north and west. Otherwise, we're watching for some pretty light icing potential. Didn't see a whole lot of reports today, but most of those, should we have them, will be pretty high up there. And across the lower Yukon Valley, Norton Sound, we might see that developing above 10,000 feet. We've got a few patchy areas of light to isolated moderate potential across the southern and eastern Gulf, not impacting southeastern or south central Alaska. And out across the western chain above 12,000 feet, light to isolated moderate icing potential will be seen there. And when we look at the upper levels of the atmosphere, we know what's driving the weather train, you might say. We see a couple dips and bends here and there, and those ridges and those troughs, as we call them, certainly drive the weather below. Out across the west, you can see a pretty predominant trough of low pressure digging toward the equator, and then a ridge right here across the Gulf, and another trough as it moves into the west coast of the lower 48 states. Sometimes the little surges of stronger wind develop, and those are usually on the south side of low pressure systems. And in this case, it's speeding up. That usually enhances the flow or the lift out ahead of that low pressure system. And that's exactly what we saw today when we saw showers and thunderstorms develop out ahead of that. That was probably due to another surge of faster moving winds in the upper atmosphere that helps enhance that lift down below. So we're watching for things like that, but we're also watching the general overall pattern that you see here, that big trough out across the Bering Sea in the North Pacific. This is guiding that wetter air into the Gulf of Alaska, and when it shows into more of a northwesterly flow in this case, the ridge beneath is grabbing onto drier air and sending that southward, so southeast is getting a taste of that. Overall, the upper level weather pattern shapes the weather at the surface, of course, as that's the main driver, and you see that southerly flow working its way up the coastline beneath a ridge of high pressure. The overall pattern in this case is a ridge, but it's interrupted by this low pressure wave sitting across the southern coastlines of Kodiak Island, about 5 to 10 knots or so. Out across the west, you can see a broad southerly flow making its way up through the Bering Strait, and the ridge controlling the weather out across the western Yukon, keeping winds light in all areas, about 10 to 15 knots. In this case, at 3,000 feet, high pressure is showing up on the map as a circulation center. We've got more of a northerly flow crossing the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. Winds are very light across the interior, only about 5 to 10 knots or so. Winds are pretty light going into southeast as well. A little bit stronger as you head into the southern Gulf. We've got a little stronger flow coming around low pressure out across the central and western Aleutians. That's driving winds up to about 20 knots or so, generally west of the St. Matthew Island waters and the Pribilofs, around 15 to 20 knots. But all in all, winds are pretty light in most areas there, and across the west you have a southerly flow. Across the interior, winds are light, and if they're moving at all, they're moving from west to southeast. As far as turbulence goes then, with high pressure and charge, chances are turbulence is not going to be a huge issue for most areas. Around Haida Gwaii and into the Dixon entrance, we were talking about some light to isolated moderate chop, generally above 2,000 feet. And out across the central and western Aleutians, probably below 5,000 feet, and that is totally due to that low pressure system working in from the west. Other than that, we'll be watching for convection, which of course always implies turbulence, icing potential, and at times poor visibility. That's a look at your flying weather across Alaska. In just a few minutes, I'll update you on the latest ice edge analysis from our sea ice team here in Alaska and, of course, your marine weather. Stay tuned.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harry Keeling, and on behalf of Alaska Public Media and the Alaskan Aviation Safety Foundation, welcome to Hangar Flying. I hope you were able to tune in last time because I pointed out that this is the first time I've ever done one by myself without a guest, but I feel so strongly about what I'm going to tell you that I wanted to just speak to you directly. And just in summary, what we were talking about was angle of attack and critical angle of attack. An angle of attack is that angle between the chord line of the wing and the relative wind. Why that's important, I mentioned that the Navy's been using it for 50 years to come aboard a carrier. Why is it important to you as a general aviation pilot? Well, I want to show you that this evening. And the NTSB and the FAA have made it easy to install it, reasonably inexpensive. The units themselves are less than $1,500, probably 6 to 8 hours of work to put them in. But essentially what you have is, as shown here, this blade antenna, or I'm not an antenna, but blade actually fits in one of the inspection holes. On my 185, I installed this in June, and it fits in the rectangular inspection plate just inboard of the wing. And that's it. And it senses the relative pressure on either side of this. In the cockpit, you have this gauge here, which I mounted mine just on the left side of the glare shield so that you can see it coming down final, but it doesn't obstruct your view. So as we mentioned earlier, mentioned last time, angle of attack is different than airspeed. Airspeed is for stalls, for VX, for VY, for best glide. All of that is dependent on a lot of factors: gross weight, G loading, density altitude. Angle of attack is not. Once you calibrate this on your airplane, it's going to do a lot of amazing things for you. Let me show you. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to turn it on, and this is what you would see when you first apply power. This is a self-test.
AOA test complete.
So, I'm going to step you through, and we're going to look at the gauge, but let me show you what I've got my hand on here. This is an airfoil, or a simulated airfoil. So as I raise the front end of the simulated airfoil, the angle of attack is going to increase. And I'm going to show you what that means, and I'll use my 185 as a reference, but I'll tell you how you can use it. So initially, what we have here is actually cruise flight. So, you know, you're cruising along at 23 squared or whatever it is, you're going to see this green indication, which indicates that you're at cruise. Now, as you increase the angle of attack, you'll see that, and this isn't in chronological sequence. If you were to take off, and let's say you rotate at 58 knots, and you've got 20 degrees of flaps, in like I would have in my 185. 58 knots is the airspeed that you would see if you really needed to get over an obstacle. But then you're going to see VX and VY. And yes, it could be an airspeed, but it also is an angle of attack. Watch. This is actually the sequence that you would see. And that's what VX would look like, which of course is is an airspeed, but you would see VX, and then if you relaxed a little bit of the backstick pressure, you would see this as VY. And you could fly that, you know, up to altitude if you wanted to maintain, your VY speed. Now when you come back around in the pattern, you're going to be at cruise, right? You're going to be back here like this. And as you slow up, let's say you're at 100 knots and you slow to 80 knots, coming around the corner, you're going to see this, and then this. And in my airplane, I've got it on 3400 Aeroset amphibs. I like to fly it a little bit fast. So on final, what I would like to see, and this correlates to about 70 to 75 knots. And then I would bring it all the way into touchdown. Very useful. In fact, if you lost your airspeed indicator, which has happened to me in an F-100, you should know about what the power setting is, but you can shoot angle of attack all the way down final. So it's a substitute for airspeed. We've run out of time this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would ask you to come back next time for one last installment on this. I want to show you how this is going to save your life. And until then, fly safe.
Thanks a lot, Harry. Great demonstration of that, and anytime you can bring props onto the show, it's a much better show. That reminds me, tomorrow is Hat and Cane Day, so make sure you watch Alaska Weather. Sea ice edge there. The last couple of days we've been watching this, a lot of open water, except for this really persnickety, persistent strip of rotting ice there just north and east of Dead Horse there. That is going, almost not quite gone, but it's there. So, yeah, things are open for business. If you are looking for some clear, ice-free water, you certainly have it there. And anytime you want to check to see just when this little sliver goes away, you can do that by going to weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php. You can get the shape files you need to actually make a map and chart this yourself and check the sea ice outlook there. Our sea ice experts are checking this daily for you now, 7 days a week. Again, their analysis there for the Arctic coastal waters of Alaska. So good stuff anytime. Here's a look at southeast wind forecast. As you'll notice, with high pressure in charge of the Gulf, we're looking at more of a northwesterly flow, and it should be a much drier flow for most areas. We'll be watching for some fog tonight, but tomorrow looks like a pretty nice day with light winds in most areas, 10 knots, 2-foot seas there, and more of a 10 to 15 knot wind coming down the coast with 5 to 6-foot seas in most areas. A southerly flow inside the North and South Lynn Canal, about 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 4-foot seas on Tuesday. By Wednesday, it's about the same, really no major change there. More of a westerly flow coming across Frederick Sound and northwesterlies coming down through Clarence Strait at 10 knots with a 2-foot sea. Otherwise, the story remains the same across the coast, 10 to 15 knots with a 4 to 5-foot sea. Seas coming down a little bit as we get into the midweek. Now, as you look at South Central, again, remember high pressure sitting out here across the Gulf. That's going to give us a light and somewhat variable wind in many places, including Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound, outside of Prince William Sound, out toward Resurrection Bay. 4-foot seas in the western Gulf, more of a westerly flow coming off of Kodiak Island and in Shelikof Strait. That's a southwesterly wind at 10 knots with a 2-foot sea. As we get into Wednesday, the winds pick up just a little bit more as high pressure shifts its focus just a hair. You'll notice more of a south and westerly flow at this point, with westerlies across the north and western Gulf, 10 to 15 knots, 3 to 4-foot seas in most areas there, 2 to 3-foot seas across the Cook Inlet, and west of the Barrens, that's a 10-knot wind with a 3-foot sea. Shelikof Strait becomes a little more southerly with time on Wednesday. As you look at the Alaska Peninsula, our northwesterlies are in control in this case. 15-knot winds inside of Bristol Bay. Northerlies coming off of Sandpoint in the Alaska Peninsula at 20 knots, and 4-foot seas also coming up the Pacific coastline toward Kodiak Island. By Wednesday, the winds become a little more variable as high pressure drops a little bit further south in the Bering. That gives us a northerly flow inside of Bristol Bay, variable flow outside of Castle Cape and Chignik with a 4-foot sea, and south of Sandpoint and King Cove, and also on the north side of the peninsula, we're still talking about very light and somewhat variable winds with seas between 2 and 4 feet. Across the Aleutians, a south and easterly flow in most areas with a couple exceptions. South of Nikolsky and Unalaska, you'll see a 10-knot wind, also variable with a 4-foot sea. Once the winds pick up, though, those seas jump right up there to about 8 feet. Otherwise, 3-foot seas in the Bering and 6-foot seas out across the western chain at 20 to 25 knots. A little bit of a switch there on Wednesday out in the west as low pressure moves a front right across between Shemya, Attu, and Kiska. You'll notice that southerly flow around Kiska, a northerly flow around Attu. That's the front right there. Southeasterlies working up through Nikolsky, Atka, and Adak at 20 to 25 knots in most cases. A 20-knot wind north of Unalaska, and still holding on to variable flow with 5-foot seas south of Unalaska and Nikolsky. Across the west coast, south and westerlies are working their way up toward Norton Sound, 15 knots with a 3 to 4-foot sea in most areas. They're northwesterlies in the Kuskokwim Delta, and variable flow around the Pribilofs with a 3-foot sea. That becomes southeasterly with time on Wednesday. Otherwise, variable winds north of Nunivak Island, westerlies across St. Lawrence with a 3-foot sea, and northerlies coming off the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta with 15 knots with a 3-foot sea on Wednesday. Now across the north slope, winds will be onshore, but they should be pretty light, and that means that little rotten area of ice probably is going to be drifting closer to the coast if it's not already stuck there. Northwesterlies around Kaktovik with a 4-foot sea. We have southerlies working their way out of Kotzebue Sound and passing Point Hope at 15 knots with a 3-foot sea there. That bends a little bit more to the south and west as we get into Wednesday. The winds around Barrow and Wainwright are either close to parallel to the coastline or blowing offshore at this point. And winds should be light onshore around Kaktovik and very light from the east around Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse with only a 2-foot sea expected there midweek. Recapping tonight's weather, showers will be probably the worst thing you see in most areas. Most of that will be confined to the interior and the west coast with high pressure in charge just outside of Bristol Bay and sitting right over the Pribilofs. We should expect a pretty expansive area of fog, especially close to the coastline, but that's also moving some of that moisture off the Bering and into the interior, where we've got a little bit of help from the jet stream to help develop a few areas of showers tonight. Across the Gulf, a lot of the clouds are vanishing, drying up and evaporating as air is pushing down from up higher in the atmosphere and pushing downward toward the water. That's limiting the cloud development somewhat. Look for some areas of light rain across the central and northern parts of southeast, but as conditions go tomorrow, things should be stabilizing in most areas. Widely scattered areas of showers and thunderstorms across the interior and northward as that moisture continues to run into the interior. Southwest, looking at some spotty areas of showers. South central should be seeing improving weather, with Kodiak probably looking at more and more sunshine. Same goes for southern parts of southeast. Pretty expansive area of fog across the Arctic coast through the Bering Strait and the northern west coast as we get into Tuesday and Wednesday, thanks to high pressure in charge there. And a slow-moving system out in the Aleutians will creep into the central Aleutians by late in the week. Thanks for watching.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
In Alaska, wildfire is a threat, but being fire-wise could save your home. Pruning your needle-bearing trees at the correct time of year and in the correct way can help slow down the spread of fire and help prevent bark beetle infestations.
Remove only the bottom 1/3 of the tree, and only from August through April.
Make an undercut several inches from the branch collar. The second cut should be through the branch, and the final cut just beyond the branch collar. Wildfires happen. Be ready.